This video series is made possible by backcountry.com. What's going on, guys? It's Paul here, finally back with the second video in this video series all around the topic of backpacking insulation. So if you haven't yet seen my first video, it was all about sleeping pads and sleeping pad warmth. So I'll put a little box up here if you want to check out that video, and I'll also put a link in the description below. But in this video, I'm going to move on to talk about sleeping bags and quilts. So I'll start off by talking about some of the aspects that apply to both sleeping bags and quilts, and then I'll go back and talk about some of the differences between them and when you might want to choose one over the other. So to give you just a quick introduction to the gear that I'm going to be referencing in this video, first of all, over here, this is the Thermarest Vesper 20. This is a 20-degree down quilt. And then over here, this underneath here, this is the Kelty Cosmic Down 20. So this is a 20-degree sleeping bag. And then up on top, this is the Marmot Micron 50. So this is also a down sleeping bag, but it's kind of a hybrid because it can be used easily as a sleeping bag or a quilt. And here are the detailed specs for all three. Now, all of these weights and dimensions are based on what I have measured at home, so they might differ a little bit from what is posted on the manufacturer's website, but feel free to pause the video on the screen if you want to know more. Now, as I mentioned, all three of these use down insulation, different types of down, but it is all down insulation. I'm not going to go too in-depth in any of that in this video because in the videos that are still to come in this series, I'm going to be doing some testing and comparing of different types of down, as well as down versus synthetic. So be sure to subscribe if you're interested in that. So with all of that said, getting into some of the aspects that apply to both sleeping bags and quilts, I want to start off by talking about temperature ratings because there's a lot that goes into that little number printed on the side of your bag. But let me first just lay out a quick scenario for you. And maybe you found yourself in this situation before, but we'll say that you're planning a backpacking trip and the forecasted low temperature is 43 degrees Fahrenheit. And we'll even say that you already know the difference between the lower limit and the comfort rating, so you choose to go with a 30-degree sleeping bag, which has a comfort rating of, say, 38 degrees, and all of that means that your forecasted low is still 5 degrees above the comfort rating. You should be good to go. You go on your backpacking trip, and you still find yourself cold at night. Well, there are many different factors that can lead to a scenario just like that, and the first of those is that temperature rating. Now, just like I talked about in the last video on sleeping pads, and there's an international standard for the testing of sleeping pad warmth, similarly, there's an international standard for the testing of sleeping bags, and you'll often see that listed as either the EN or the ISO rating. I wouldn't worry too much about that. EN is just the old standard that was kind of phased out in 2016. ISO is new. They both produce pretty much the same results, which is why some manufacturers list it as the EN/ISO rating. Now, there are two primary ratings listed on that, the first being the lower limit, which basically just means if you curl up in a ball, you will make it through the night at that temperature in this bag. But of course, that's not usually what you're after. You want to be comfortable throughout the night. So usually about 10 to 12 degrees above the lower limit is the comfort rating. But keep in mind that most manufacturers list their bags by the limit rating and not the comfort rating. Now, there are a few important things to know about those two ratings. First of all, when they do that test at the lab, they're placing a dummy, a thermal mannequin, inside the sleeping bag, and that mannequin is wearing a full base layer of clothing. So those ratings are with the assumption that you're wearing at least a full base layer to bed, including a hat. And secondly, those tests are being done with a sleeping pad, an insulated sleeping pad, with an R value of 4.8, which is pretty high as far as backpacking sleeping pads go. Now, beyond just those aspects of the temperature rating, there are other factors that can affect your warmth, like are you naturally more of a cold sleeper or a warm sleeper? In general, women tend to sleep a little colder than men, so if you're a female, you may want to add more like 15 degrees to the lower limit in order to find your comfort rating. Another factor is, are you an active sleeper at night, or are you one of the lucky ones that can actually stay in one place? If you move around a lot at night, you can lose some extra heat that way. And the final thing that I'll mention that can affect your warmth at night is getting a bag that's the wrong size. If you get a sleeping bag or a quilt that is too small, what's going to happen is that at night, you're going to have a tendency to press against the inside of the bag. And I don't know how well you can actually see that on the camera, but when I'm pushing on the inside, it's compressing that insulation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next video in this series. But when you compress that insulation, you end up with a cold spot there, and you can lose a lot of heat that way. The same thing goes for the foot box. So if you get a quilt or a bag that is too short, then your feet are going to press up against the very end and compress the insulation down there. So all of those factors are just things to keep in mind the next time that you're trying to pick out a new sleeping bag or a quilt. And when you are in the market for new gear, you should check out the sponsor of this video, which is backcountry.com. All the sleeping bags and quilts that I'm talking about in this video can be found on their website, such as the Kelty Cosmic Down 20, which is a great option if you're looking for a good budget sleeping bag, or if you're looking to drop a little bit more weight, you could check out something like the Thermarest Hyperion, which is basically a sleeping bag version of this Thermarest Vesper quilt. And if you need any help selecting the right gear for you, you can always chat with the Backcountry Gearhead. If this is your first time placing an order with Backcountry, you can enter coupon code GearTest15 at checkout to save 15% off your order. And thank you once again to Backcountry for making this video possible. So the next thing I want to talk about is Baffle Design. And baffles are just these sewn in chambers in sleeping bags and quilts that help keep the insulation a little more evenly distributed throughout the bag. Now what you'll see oftentimes with warmer weather bags like these, this is a 50 degree, is that the outer shell is sewn through directly to the inner lining. And as you can see from this thermal image, where the fabric is pinched together there at the seams, there's no room for any insulation, so you end up with some heat loss at those seams. Now that's not really a big deal for a warmer weather bag like this. In fact, it's one of the reasons why this is rated at 50 degrees, but you certainly would not want that type of design for a colder weather bag, which is why both of these, which are both 20 degrees, instead of being sewn through, there's the outer shell, the inner lining, and then there's this vertical wall between the two that still keeps the baffles separated, but it allows the down insulation to be a little more evenly distributed, and it prevents the cold spots that you saw with the 50 degree bag. Now, in addition to the baffle seams, the other thing I want you to pay attention to is the shape of the baffles. Most sleeping bags are not in a grid pattern like this one, so I'm just going to kind of toss that off to the side and just talk about these two for a while. As you can see, both of these have almost entirely horizontal, much longer, larger baffles, and that's more so what you're going to see oftentimes with sleeping bags and quilts. Now, there is some debate out there about which is better, primarily horizontal or primarily vertical baffles, meaning they're running the length of the bag. I've used both and I haven't noticed a huge difference either way, but it is important to pay attention to, because the good and bad thing about baffles and the shape of them when they're larger like this is that it can allow the insulation to move around a little bit. Now, I say that can be a bad thing because if you're like me and you're a side sleeper and you tend to move around a good bit at night, what can happen is that where your arm is up against the top of the sleeping bag or the quilt there, as you're moving around, over time, that insulation can start to drift off to the sides, and that results in a cold spot right there in the center. Now, I kind of like the Vesper quilt for that reason, because it's mostly horizontal baffles, but then they do have a vertical seam that runs the length of the quilt, and it kind of keeps that insulation from drifting too far away. But as I said, at times that can also be a good thing if you want to be able to move the insulation around on purpose. So for example, if you're in a sleeping bag and you already have a warm sleeping pad, so you don't really need much insulation underneath you, well, then you have the ability to move that insulation around. Say if you have a cold spot next to your shoulder or your back or wherever it may be, you can kind of customize where you want that extra warmth. So you may want to keep the baffle layout in mind the next time you're shopping for a sleeping bag or a quilt. But either way, before your next backpacking trip, or even periodically throughout the trip, you might want to hold it up to the light so you can kind of see how the insulation is distributed. You can kind of see if there are any cold spots, and if there are, you can start to work the insulation back into that area. So with all of those things covered, let's talk about some of the differences between sleeping bags and quilts, and when you might want to choose one or the other. Design-wise, sleeping bags you're all familiar with, I'm sure. So, you have a zipper that runs down the length of the bag so you can enclose yourself in this little cocoon. You have insulation all the way around you. And then most sleeping bags, especially these mummy-style bags, are going to have some type of hood. The other sleeping bag I showed you earlier did not, so there are some that just have a rectangular opening, and those are the ones that kind of allow you to use it a little more as a hybrid. So if you want to just leave it partially unzipped, you can use it basically the same as a quilt. With the mummy bag, it's a little more difficult to do that because you've got a weird hood in your way. But the downside to sleeping bags, and the reason why so many people have switched to quilts, is that you have insulation underneath you, and when you're on top of that insulation, you're compressing the insulation, it loses the majority of its insulating properties. So with a sleeping bag, you tend to carry a little extra material, but you're not necessarily getting the benefit of it. When it comes to the design of quilts, most all of them are still going to have a fully enclosed foot box. Some of them have a drawstring or zipper opening so that you can open that up and just lay it flat. Others are just completely sewn closed like this one. And what you'll notice is that there is no back panel, so there's no insulation underneath you from the quilt. When you're using a quilt, all the insulation underneath you is coming from your sleeping pad. So with quilts, because you're not carrying that extra material, that extra insulation that would be underneath you, they tend to be a good bit lighter weight than a sleeping bag. Now, the first question that most people that have never used a quilt tend to ask about them is, don't you end up with drafts? So you end up with a lot of heat escaping. And I would say the answer is yes and no. There's always a possibility of drafts with a quilt, but there are certainly things that can be done to minimize those. Going back to what I said earlier about the importance of getting a bag that's the right size, if you get a quilt that's too small, you might not have enough material to adequately wrap around you and tuck it in to seal off any draft points. Or if it's just barely long enough, you might get it tucked in and you're perfectly warm until you move around, and then you get one side of the quilt lifting up and you get a draft there. So it's even more critical with a quilt to make sure you get a large enough quilt that you can seal off those draft points. The next thing that really helps with that is that most quilts are going to come with some type of pad strap. These are the ones that come with the Thermarest Vesper. As you can probably guess, a pad strap is designed to go around your sleeping pad, and then it hooks into either some type of clip, or in this case, a little loop on both sides of your pad, and that just helps keep the quilt cinched down around your pad to seal off those draft points. Another important spot is around the neck opening. So a lot of quilts are going to have some type of button snap up here so that you can snap it closed around you, and then they'll have some type of a drawstring so that you can really cinch up the end around your shoulders, around your neck, to seal off any air openings. To help with that, one thing I really like about this quilt is that it has some extra insulation, basically a draft collar, up here around the neck opening as well as down the two sides. It's just an extra little bit of insulation to seal off any gaps. Now, not all quilts have that. This one does. Most of the ones that you're going to see that are in this range, like a 20 degree, will have some type of draft collar, but that's just a little design feature that you might want to look out for if you're going to be using your quilt in colder weather. Now, even with all of that, even with pad straps and draft collars and cinching everything down, all that good stuff, there's still the possibility of drafts at night, especially if you move around a good bit. That's just one of the inherent risks of using a quilt. However, what I will say about that is that the colder it gets, the more of an impact those drafts have. So what I mean by that is that, say, 50, 60 degrees at night, you might get a draft point and still be able to sleep through it. You may not even really notice it. However, as it gets a little bit colder, 30, 40 degrees, you're going to notice a draft. If you get a draft point during the night, it's probably going to wake you up. And then, of course, as it gets even colder, it's going to be an even bigger impact. So because of that, basically the way that I go about it is if it's going to be roughly, freezing and above 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 Celsius and above, I'm probably going to go with a quilt because I do prefer using a quilt. But as it gets colder below freezing, I'm probably going to be switching over to a sleeping bag just for that extra warmth. The other big difference between bags and quilts, and what has mostly caused me to make quilts my go-to, is the comfort. Quilts are a lot less restrictive than sleeping bags. You've got a little more wiggle room there. It's a little more like using a blanket on your bed at home, and I just find quilts, for those reasons, a lot more comfortable, which is why Anytime it's above freezing, quilts are my go-to, but that's very much personal preference. Some people very much prefer the wrapped in a cocoon feeling of a sleeping bag, so they choose to go that route. One other difference that people often talk about between sleeping bags and quilts is the cost. And the idea behind that is that because quilts use less material, they're cheaper. And I would say in general, comparing apples to apples, I would say that quilts are a little bit cheaper on average. However, you can easily find $500 sleeping bags and you can easily find $500 quilts. And then at the same time, you can find budget sleeping bags like this one and you can find budget quilts. So there's a wide range. So if you've made it with me all the way to this point in the video, would you give it a thumbs up? It really helps out the channel. You can also click the subscribe button if you want to see more of my videos in the future. Also, leave me a comment in the comment section and let me know if you prefer using a sleeping bag or a quilt or when you choose one or the other. Thank you once again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.